unfinished project, and when deleted footage would end up in the garbage. I wish that latter part were hyperbole, but not always the case. So in general, with many of these films, it seemed to be a case of if footage was shot, but a project was incomplete, the studios would sit on it. Whether it was the initial 10 Tigers footage here for Shaw's, the 1972 Game of Death footage for Golden Harvest, if the studio knew they could do something with the footage, it wasn't going anywhere. After all, money was already put into a project they needed to eventually make a return. But then, on the flip side, if a film is considered complete, any extraneous footage would be fair game to be lost or trashed. Going back to Bruce Lee, the most infamous example would be footage missing from his first film for Golden Harvest, The Big Boss, as the film was already completed and released in theaters, and a deleted footage was seemingly unneeded at the time. But with Game of Death, even after its sort of completed release in 1978, Golden Harvest knew there was too much extra footage to just get rid of. But then you have a bizarre example with Golden Harvest, where they were in the early stages of filming a direct sequel to Winners and Sinners. That was not My Lucky Stars, but all that survived were still photos. That's not to say Shaw's didn't occasionally also go, we give up on a project, as David Chang began directorial duties on a film that would have been called The Whirlwind Kick, where he would have also starred as a blind martial artist. Allegedly due to choreography issues and Chang's own schedule backing up, the project was dropped, and much like the missing Winners and Sinners 2, only still seemingly survived. Meanwhile, there's always the decades-old debate of dubbing versus original language. And the only reason why I bring that up now is seeing Wei Pai being dubbed by the much more mature-sounding Ted Thomas, who I brought up earlier as having dubbed Ku Feng. In this film alone, he also dubs both Cheng Sheng and Yong Hong, so he's essentially dubbing 3 of the 10 Tigers. The funny thing is, many times they would have multiple voice actors bunched together to dub at once. Ted Thomas himself even mentioned in an interview that the analog process of recording while watching the film and then trying to match the audio tape to the optical track would sometimes lead to the infamous lines not being fully synced. Granted, now in the modern digital era, it's much easier to try to get lines to at least come out only while lips are moving, even if they're different languages. As someone who's done audio sync for various Blu-rays of Hong Kong films from the 70s and 80s, it can be a challenge depending on the film, but it makes you appreciate what limited technology they had at the time. Now, this is something I feel like we were seeing a lot in Hong Kong martial arts films going from the 70s into the 80s, and that, of course, is the lion dance. Within Shaw's films, aside from this example here, there, of course, is the very elaborate example from Lau Kar Leung, where he basically teaches the audience of the film martial club. Golden Harvest had a double whammy of intricate lion dances in both Dreadnought and, of course, Jackie Chan's The Young Master, which ends up being the catalyst for that film's main plotline, and ironically co-starring Wei Pai. So I've discussed this in other commentaries, but years ago I wondered what the significance of a lion grabbing lettuce was. Turns out the Chinese words for wealth and lettuce are somewhat similar, with the Cantonese for raw vegetables being san koi, but apparently the character for raw can also mean to produce or create. While the tone of the second word, koi, can be changed to actually mean wealth. So in short, the lettuce plays as a nod to the similarities in the phrasing of both lettuce, or more specifically raw vegetables, and wealth. But aside from all of this, the primary purpose of the lion dance was to scare off a creature in Chinese mythology known as the Nian. This is also why they had the clustered firecracker fireworks, which we just saw earlier, and why in some films, such as Dreadnought, you actually see many dressed in red. Granted, I feel like this was sort of a quick example. So a little more info on Wang Longwei. Unlike most of the other Shaw's actors from what info I could find, he was trained in Okinawan Goju-ryu style karate, at least as a first dan black belt, possibly higher. Despite this, he was skilled at mimicking various Chinese styles, which is evident in his fight against Gordon Liu in Lau Kar Leung's martial club, where both Wang and Liu's Wong Fei Hong continually switch up various shapes down an increasingly narrow alleyway. His practice in the style definitely lent itself to a stockier build, much like when I used to train in Okinawan Shorin Ryu as a stocky teen. But of course, his one fight in this film would be a bit more weapon-based, albeit culminating with a very unorthodox weapon, and I don't mean the Wudang sword style. So I want to go on a bit of a general Shaw Brothers tangent, and that's discussing the studios that brought the Shaw's films to the West. That would primarily be both Warner Brothers and World Northall. Now, 10 Tigers was given its US release in 1981 by World Northall, but of course it would be the Warner Brothers release of King Boxer as Five Fingers of Death in 1973 that would cause the initial explosion. Funny enough though, Warner Brothers wouldn't put much stock in the Shaw's films, as the two main examples of their releases would be the aforementioned Five Fingers of Death, and then a more rare Shaw's film directed by the late Chor Yun, simply entitled The Killer, but would be released in the US as The Sacred Knives of Vengeance. Warners would focus on more of their own output, such as the legendary Enter the Dragon, and to a lesser extent, Black Belt Jones. And other indie companies would dabble in distribution, such as National General Pictures, best known for releasing Bruce Lee's 2 Lowe-directed films, releasing The New One-Armed Swordsman as Triple Irons, then Enchanted Film Arts releasing Jimmy Wong Yu's The Chinese Boxer as The Hammer of God. It really wouldn't be until the later 70s when World Northall snatched up theatrical and especially TV rights to these films that the Shaws would truly thrive in the US. Granted, the films went through even more retitles, such as Chang-Chi's The Duel now becoming The Duel of the Iron Fist, 5 Venoms being promoted to 5 Deadly Venoms, and of course one of the most famous and drastic retitles, The 36th Chamber of Shaolin becoming The Master Killer, despite the fact that, spoiler alert, Gordon Liu's character Sante kills nobody. That's part of the character's growth, in fact. But even something as lighter-hearted as Martial Club would be retitled Instructors of Death. And that brings us back to this film, one of the few examples I can think of where for its US release, it pretty much kept its original title, though some versions say 10 Tigers of Kwantung, others say 10 Tigers from Kwantung, though that's splitting hairs. Of course, there are other examples of unscathed titles upon World Northall's distribution, such as The Chinatown Kid and The Kid with Golden Arm, but once again, I digress. Now, another general Shaw Brothers tinge is the music used in these films. If you picked up Arrow's first Shawscope box set, and if you're listening to this, there's a good chance you did, then it's no secret that a lot of the music used in these films were from the DeWolf Music Library. Now, while it's well documented that many Hong Kong and Taiwanese films, for that matter, films in the 70s used whatever music they felt like, DeWolf was different as the film studios were able to obtain the music license for those tracks. Some examples of cues used in this film would be World in Action by Keith Popworth, Drama Sting No. 3 by Peter Knight, and Stalking by Jack Tromby. Now, that's not to say they didn't still use cues from other films if they felt so inclined. 10 Tigers also has music from the films Witchfinder General and A Minute to Pray, A Second to Die. And that's the interesting thing. As Hong Kong film went into the 80s, they were getting even more worldwide distribution. It seemed like they were slowly more cautioned to move away from just grabbing whatever music they wanted and actually either license music from music libraries such as DeWolf or have exclusive music composed, such as when Michael Lai actively composed scores for the 80s Jackie Chan films. Granted, you had composers like Frankie Chan who would still grab music from wherever, such as his use of Les Baxter's score for the Dunwich Horror and Tower of Death, the use of Gustav Holst's The Planet Suite for The Young Master, and of course, liberal use of Pink Floyd in the Cantonese re-release of The Big Boss. But going back to DeWolf, the other downside with using music libraries is that you would often hear shared music cues among very different genres of film. For example, you could hear a music cue in a Shaw Brothers martial arts film that would end up in George Romero's horror classic Dawn of the Dead, or music in the intro to Jackie Chan's Snake and Crane Arts of Shaolin that would become popularized by the comedy classic Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Wide Horizon and Ice Flow by Pierre Harvey to be exact. So, as we're just about to get into another, hey, this is all just a misunderstanding fight scene amidst the 10 Tigers, I want to bring up the one fight choreographer on this film that has a much smaller production filmography than the others, and that is Leung Ting. If you go straight to his online filmographies, it only seems to show about 6 collaborations with Chang-Chi, specifically The Brave Archer Part 2, The 5 Venoms, Invincible Shaolin, Life Gamble, Heaven and Hell, and of course, 10 Tigers. The only non-Chang-Chi film he worked on was apparently a self-backed film, a potential pseudo-documentary that he wrote, directed, and starred in called It's a Mad, 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 Mad Kung Fu World in 2000. It has a whopping 7 votes on the Internet Movie Database with an average rating of a 3.8 out of 10. Sounds like I've been missing out. But it sounds like he's more interesting outside of the film world, as even quick research shows that he was allegedly trained by Bruce Lee's teacher, the one and only Yip Man. However, despite various photos of the two of them together, apparently Yip Man's eldest son, Yip Chun, called Leung Ting out saying, and I quote, "My father disliked this person Leung Ting the most, and Leung Ting is not Yip Man's student." Basically, Leung Ting struck back with various photo evidence that they at least knew each other and threatened a defamation claim that Yip Chun apparently did not respond to. For some reason, it seems like there's always controversy in regards to the students of Yip Man, including how much training he gave to Bruce Lee, versus how much training Bruce Lee actually received from one of Yip Man's senior students, Wong Shun-young, who you can see in the documentary Bruce Lee, the Man and the Legend, on the set of Enter the Dragon. On that note, with all of the unofficial Yip Man films without Donnie Yen, I'm surprised none of them have tried to deep dive into all of the people who claim to know him with some sort of Rashomon-style layout of people laying out their alleged relationships and flashbacks with him. Then again, while many of the official films are pushing their luck, it felt like that may be ripe for potential lawsuits. So, as we're about to see Kufeng execute probably the worst exit strategy you can think of, let's discuss the whole anti-kung fu rhetoric enforced by the villains that was very prominent in many other films at the time, especially with Chang-Chi films. So, when Manchuria took over China, there was a shift from the Ming to the Qing dynasty due to a variety of factors. However, in order to prevent the Han race, which was essentially pre-Manchurian Chinese, from rebelling against the government, virtually all forms of martial arts training was forbidden. This is why you have several moments in this film where the villains sort of raise an eyebrow at either the implication of a gym opening or knowing someone who may know martial arts. So in order to preserve the fighting styles, all martial arts training for nearly 300 years would be in secret.